Hello everyone, today we talk about Romano-Brittonic warfare, specifically in post-imperial times, for what it means, at least in a formal institutional sense. It's actually a very blurred context. As you know, unfortunately, we do not know too much about this period in general. This is also starting from the same British historiography, where we began to talk about the so-called Dark Ages, because if anything, from a documentary point of view, we know really a few, especially compared to the rest of post-Roman Europe. However, I also think that aside from such definition, and of course the way it can be profitably criticized, at least in the way it sort of impacted the, say, pop view of the wall, I learned, especially in the last years, which I dedicated myself a bit more to Anglo-Saxon and Celtic fringe history and warfare. There's always more than one normal thing scratching beneath the surface, obviously, but also from a broader historical point of view. This video belongs to the Army Organization series, so we will stick essentially to that organic dimension. However, it's also important, given that it's the first video that I make on this specific, say, political and military history, to talk a bit about the general background. Of course, always in this military key, and highlighting, of course, everything that pertains to the organization of the Romano-Brittonic armies. We will talk surely about the Gallo-Roman armies at some point. We'll talk about Armorica. And there is a lot out there. As you know, I've already made videos about the Giles, the Picts, the Scots, and this just falls nicely together with the rest. So there are many ways one can interpret this period. In a way, looking at the beginning, let's say the early 5th century, you realize that the few remaining Roman troops in Britain had, of course, undergone an important degree of Brittonization. We cannot make a history of Roman Britain. I actually have at least in this video, having in store a series about Romano-Brittonic warfare in the sense of properly like the Roman invasions and conquest of Britain. I already made a video about the Battle of Mons Graupius, so we have enough stuff. This is valid also for the post-Roman times as well. Looking at the neighbors of this, still quite strongly Celtically influenced territories that we say Romanized, Latinate to a degree, but of course this aspect of the Brittonization of post-Roman warfare in the British archipelago is definitely relevant also for those areas, those wards had not been directly ruled by Rome, but that, however, had left an important mark in their military organization. Gaelic Ireland surely bears important traces of this. We are talking, however, about something bigger that would require, in fact, a bit more of history that pertains, however, to make the very long story short, to a pretty ugly revolution with even probably some social instances, not just merely political military interplay, that sort of redrew, for example, things like property boundaries. You have war bands coming from the outer side. You have especially the Celtic fringe putting a lot of pressure on this system that is still ruled by post-Roman warlords, as we will see now. That, however, because of the infighting and such general abandonment from the imperial army that has left for safeguarding other parts of the continent, will also be invaded by what we call the Anglo-Saxons, because of course, like, where are the poor youths, right? It's always the question we pose ourselves at this point. That, however, entered Britain not just a much longer time before this, we have evidence of Saxon settlements in Roman Britain since the 2nd century AD, regulated also by imperial authorities, but notoriously also the greater Anglo-Saxon migration happens because of this initial acknowledgement of what was going on in Britain through the first mercenaries that were hired by these Romano-Brittonic warlords that eventually started taking over, a bit like it had happened in the rest of Western Europe with the Federati. Here, again, the boundaries culturally, in part ethnically, are much more blurred. If anything, because Roman Britain had been, yes, Romanized, urbanized, etc., but did not have such a robust statal legacy like other parts of Europe. Naturally, in the north, everything is more complicated. There's less surplus, less opportunity for power concentration. In fact, what you see in the following centuries, before the compaction at least of the main, like essentially what became the kingdom of the English, and then also Pictland and other few powers would in fact mirror this instability, this turbulence, this fragmentation, where of course we can't see too much, as we were saying before. The term for British warrior in this Arthurian age, we'll talk about Arthur later, was the Combrogi, in Latin Combrogi at this point, or Cymri, that we were discussing incidentally just the other day in the video about the Boy and the Cimbrian migrations, because this Indo-European term of uniquely Celto-Germanic origin and use refers to this, in fact, ethnic elementary background of fellow countrymen that in part would have come again also from outside what were the boundaries of Roman Britain, but that also mirrored the resurgence of some local levies to an unprecedented degree. What the Roman state had, generally speaking, disarmed the population. In late Roman times, of course, things had remilitarized a bit, but now, with the collapse of central authority, things become much more complicated for everyone, and so there is an increased level of militarization for even the humble peasant that will get more used back again to raiding, throat cutting, cattle stealing, and more. So at this time, you see the Romano-Brittonic armies being commanded by duces, so military leaders, a term that, as you know, is used a bit like all over the post-Roman world, in the Latin, Germanic, and Celtic world, stressing properly the military nature of these, in fact, warlords. Right? These are not comites like in the more in the tidier, let's say, Merovingian de facto empire that stretches over vast swaths of continental Europe just across the Channel. There is an emphasis on the seigniorialization of the system. These duces, in the early 5th century, so at the moment essentially of the Roman bailout from Britain, have the control over three main areas, respectively. Essentially, there had been an originary military command of Upper and Lower Britain. There are the major divisions of Roman Britannia. And in fact, these duches are when things were still relatively functional, and that the continuity, of course, with the Romano-Brittonic army organization, the Comes Britanniae, the Comes Litoris Saxonici, so the Count of the Saxon Shore, and the Dux Britanniarum. The Comes Britanniae led a mobile cavalry field army, as indicated by historical references from Gildas and Nennius. We don't have too much time to get into the specifics of the sources, but here we're referring, of course, to the continuity of the, say, more or less historically consolidated idea of a mobile force, the comitatenses, plus the more local provincial force of the Limitani that here is gradually also sort of molding, that decaying part and blending with more tribal influences. The Dux Britanniarum was tasked with defending the northern frontier that had been more problematic, and managed the forts, in fact, along Hadrian's wall, with troops in this area often being hereditary at this point. So you see here this sort of vassalization, and again, it can be an anachronism as a term, but definitely the tendencies of that senioralization, that privatization are evident, especially on the vestiges of the infrastructural base of this massive Roman fortification. And here we're talking about, say, the passing down through generations, like to sons following typically their fathers, into the same military units, and creating thus a local force. By the end of the 6th century, say by the 70s, the duchess had basically given way to a much more complex system. The term dux is to be found still, but this Roman military administration doesn't quite mirror the political geography of Britain, post-Roman Britain, at least in this case. In fact, there had been now numerous independent Roman successor kingdoms ruled by so many of these different leaders. And let's see what they are, right? The destruction of Britain, let's say, if you want, as a civilized and Christian community, had begun, first of all, with the usurper Magnus Maximus. You know that there is some tradition, that was even recovered at some point in a historical way, regarding the Welsh folklore, this idea that the continuity of the Roman element from in the Celtic French as successors of Roman rule. This general had essentially withdrawn troops to the continent, leaving Britannia defenseless at some point, as a matter of fact. And this absence of an effective army from 410 allowed the attacks from the Picts and the Scots to intensify. This could not really take over the civilized bulk of Britain in the southeast. That's where actually the Anglo-Saxons would settle. And yes, these were combined to the local Romanized world, like with a much bulkier and sort of much more expansive and aggressive force than the Celts could be. In the moment the Anglo-Saxons stepped onto the British shores, they knew that, imperially speaking, the entirety of the archipelago was theirs, right? And this is something that lives on in the Bretwalda, probably in the imperial nature of Anglo-Saxon leadership. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever in their sense, their certainty in their own moral superiority over the Celts. And so an appeal for help from Emperor Honorius from the side of the Britons due to this external pressure was ignored, leading to the aforementioned fragmentation of Britain into separate political entities resembling old tribal regions, with local Celtic powers emerging and consolidating their military influence as well. Gildas criticizes these leaders as tyrants who wage unjust wars and rewarded corrupt companions, and there is nothing positive about this whole story. It's the collapse of a civilization, of a specific Catholic worldview. It's terrifying in many ways, but it's also the consequence of responsibilities, both locally and internationally. In the midst of civil strife and attacks, the Gallo-Roman leader Germanus arrived in 429 to fight the Pelagian heresy that had started from Ireland, also serving as a military leader, so to make order in Britain. By 447-49, another Romano-Brittonic leader, Vortigern, facing manpower shortages, allows Saxons to settle in Britain in exchange for military service, granting territories like the Isle of Thanet and Kent to the Jutish brothers Hengist and Horsa. I made a video about the kingdom of the Kentish, if you're interested in that. And this decision, though seen as pivotal, mirrored typical late Roman practices as well. It wasn't again first time that Saxon warbanders had been present in Britain. In that case, like they were like a regular force since the 3rd century. As the Saxon presence grew, however, conflicts escalated because of the general frailty of the previous local order, often resulting in victories for the Saxons alone, who stormed towns and massacred inhabitants. Some Britons fled to Brittany / Armorica / Bretagne, while others retreated to more defensible areas. Right, Brittany is called like this because of all these Britons that left their island and essentially gave a new name to Armorica, right, as a British land herself on the continent. The western regions of Britain saw a refortification of hill forts during the sub-Roman period, because, as you know, the Anglo-Saxons were coming from the east. And there is literally a major shift in the settlement of the elites from those areas to the west. Right, there is actually for a while a nearly complete disappear of Christianity. Right, and you start finding all these Christian symbols moving west that otherwise had not been that much of a more Christianized place compared to the southeast. In Roman times, showing exactly what was going on. Archaeology in this sense is very clear. I made a video about this. I should actually re-upload it, but you can still listen to it on Schwerpunkt. However, not all Saxons fought against the Romano-Britons. Some fought alongside them, and there were successors for British leaders like Vortimer. A turning point came when Hengist treacherously invited Vortigern to a banquet, leading to the latter's capture and significant territorial concessions to the Germans. The rationale for the 7th century Anglo-Saxon settlement in the north was likely influenced by the need to combat the Scottish Picts and Irish Scotti. So as we were saying before, there was an actual stability in the southeast, regardless of this leadership struggle, right? But it was important not to give in the north, because that Celtic presence would have been disrupting, like the stability that was now so difficultly fought over in the south, and especially in the absence of surviving garrisons along Hadrian's Wall. However, some forts along the Seine were actually reoccupied and refortified, as we were observing during the 6th century. Some people have called this the Baden generation after the famous battle. An inscription from that era at the former Roman fort of Vindolanda mentions a local Romano-Brittonic warlord named Brigomaglus. These are very Celtic names, by the way, possibly sharing power with another leader, Riacus. This suggests a resurgence, essentially, of Brittonic resistance in the northern part of Britannia Secunda. So the second, the first was in fact in the south, potentially allowing the population to appoint their own military leader, or dukes, hence the duchess, sort of start multiplying after those that had already held the various provinces of immediate post-Roman Britain. When Nennius refers to Arthur, for example, using this title, he may be highlighting the distinct military authority of a dukes compared to the civilian and judicial roles of kings that also start appearing as reges in the sources. And in this context, Arthur and other warlords likely operated as they were called, we'll see now, duces bellorum, so literal warlords, like, because it means leaders of the wars, right? So people who lived essentially warring as a living under the cooperative leadership, however, of British kings that were already sort of enveloping them, especially in the frontier areas that saw this stronger turbulence. Let's look a bit at the political geography. The major powers among the Romano-Brittonic powers were V-VIII, Powys, and Gwynedd in Wales. This would remain the more developed or more, at least, institutionally stable areas. Because, of course, the Anglo-Saxons, as we said, took over the more civilized places, and so these Romano-Brittonic powers, as you know, remained in the west, in the north, as sort of more peripheral, less developed areas. Dumnonia, Brythonic, I will be butchering, of course, the original phonetics, Elmet, Reged, Gododin, and Strathclyde. So, speaking of the Welsh fortified sites from the 5th to 7th century served as power centers, of course, linked to a rising post-Roman elite that in many cases did come straight from the most developed centers of Britannia before they were taken over by the Germans. We have notable residences that were villas slash castles, practically. I made videos on this. And so the origin of the manor, if you want, the minsters, at least that is in the Germanic context here. The Celtic French was something else. We have, in fact, Dinas Emrys in northwest Wales, birthed Arthur on Anglo-Saxon. By the end of the 6th century, the tribal territory of the ancient Ordovicas evolved into Gwynedd, right? Likely the strongest kingdom, this Romano-Brittonic kingdom, in what had been at least Britannia Prima. Gildas notes Vertiporius as a tyrant of the Demete, the famous Demetacum as a settlement in ancient times, reflecting the civitas that became the kingdom of V-VIII in the southwest, where remnants of a Romano-Brittonic elite survived until the 11th century. And that's how long, especially, this Welsh history is, like in this sub-Roman Romano-Brittonic identity, right? And also military organizations, as we will see. The ancient Silures civitas were in the south of Wales, fragmented in the 6th century into Gwent in eastern Wales and Glamorgan to the west, ruled by chieftains in hill forts. The land of charters highlight the existence of various kingdoms, including Ceredigion, Wilth, and Gower from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Remember that there may have been a literal continuity with Roman political, institutional, and administrative systems, so that in Carolingian times you could have still seen, by traveling across Wales, Roman imperial symbols, right? Actual military units treasuring, even though those ancient sacred banners. There is a lot about this also in Gaul, at least in the earlier times. And so we do know, of course, of continuity, even in the existence of single Roman units that had remained there. Now, during the 7th and 8th centuries, these kingdoms experienced consolidation, because there is a bit of a resurgence, as you know, from the tougher times. It was really typical, especially from the 8th. It was timid in Northern Europe, but still palpable. You have High Kings of Wales based in Glamorgan, Deheubarth, and Powys, and small entities were absorbed as well, resulting in their rulers becoming lesser subjected leaders. Of course, they would keep ruling as local lords, but under a greater power that was increasingly hierarchical and stratified. Dinas Povis emerged as a significant centre in Wales during the 5th to 7th centuries, housing a chieftain's court amidst a Romano-Celtic aristocracy that attracted warriors echoing imperial governance from also the broader surroundings, even places that had not been brought directly under Roman rule in the past, because just of the prestige that came out of that, and the Romans had Celtic auxiliaries as well as foes at the same time, coming from those places when they had an imperial government in Britain as well. The poetry attributed to Taliesin praises Cynan, king of Powys, who launches successful campaigns against other Welsh leaders, including an expedition into Anglesey. And in the following centuries, Powys formed strong alliance with neighboring Mercia against Saxon Northumbria, so fully entering that interplay, with, in this case, actually supporting a bit more like, well, okay, we're in an early time, but Mercia is going to be more civilized. I made a video about it than Northumbria. If anything, as you know, the Welsh, the general Celtic fringe, also later on with the Vikings, etc., will try instead to destabilize the Saxon south, and consequently also Mercia, that had been sort of at some point subdued by, or at least lost its hegemony in England in favor of Wessex. I made a video about the Battle of Brunanburh, if you're interested in that. Then we have Dumnonia, as we were saying. The civitas of the Dumnoni in Cornwall and Devon evolved into the kingdom of Dyfnwyd. During the late 5th century, Dumnonia appeared to be one of the most prosperous regions in Britain. The name of the land comes from the fact that literally the fertility of the territory, and that together with the relative isolation in the far southwest, sort of allowed, also from a strategical point of view, some sort of this long line also that surrounded this corridor you have to enter if you want to advance into it. Like, it's difficult to enter it from the outside. And this level of prosperity, relative prosperity for the times and places, of course, brought likely to the ability to muster a strong military force. The Dumnonian extensive coastlines and maritime tradition also facilitated troop movements across the Channel. This is the land from which, as we were saying before, many Britons had escaped the Anglo-Saxon invasion and taken refuge into Brittany. That is today's Brittany. Gildas described the region of Dumnonia as being ruled by a tyrant named Constantine, which of course reflects some Roman continuity in leadership, or at least the inspirational models. A Constantine who was linked to a royal lineage, by the way, not naturally royal for the local concept of regus, not with say the Roman imperial world or anything. Archaeological findings suggest that pewter coins or tokens featuring a king, possibly Elabius, were minted during this time. There is a theory that sees 5th, 6th century Dumnonian elites partly derived from the Romano-British civitas that had existed before, governing the local lordships based on hill forts that naturally had established themselves also there during the peak of fragmentation. However, still under the authority of a central rule based in Tintagel. Then we have Brythonic, which I surely haven't pronounced correctly. Brythonic emerges from the southern territories of the Votadini, likely as a result of the division of the militarized Roman area known as Iran Ogledd, that is to say the Old North, following Coilhand's death in 420. This kingdom was probably governed from Dingardi, that is Bamber, until it succumbed to the Saxons in 604. We have Elmet, also known as Elfed, emerging in the late 5th century during the fragmentation of Coelhan's kingdom. As we just recalled, this polity occupied territory between the river Humber and Hadrian's Wall, which was a big deal because, of course, like the space that it encompassed, but laid beyond it from both sides, even extending slightly north of the wall, and appearing to be a quasi-continuation of the Roman military zone in the north, interestingly enough. After Elmet fell to the Saxons in 617, any hope for the British to retain control over the Pennines effectively disappeared. In late Roman times, the northern region of Britain was governed by proxy local rulers already. These were known, as we've seen before, as Duces Britanniarum, with the yet aforementioned Coelhan being the last of these rulers, living from around 350 to 420. His kingdom had extended from north of the modern Liverpool to Hadrian's Wall, therefore a very strategic area that was also exposed coastally to the Gaelic piracy, and across both coastlines as well. After Coelhan's son, Morab Tenno, died, northern Britain split in two areas: Ebrauc in the east, which was after Eboracum, York, and Reget in the west. By 535, this further split into a northern-southern area under the leadership of Urien, a descendant of Coelhan. Reget became the most powerful Romano-Brittonic kingdom in the region. We're talking between the 30s and the 90s of the 6th century. Its center was Carlisle. This area continued to have Romanized elite and institutions, acting as a defense against the encroaching Bernician Anglo-Saxons from the east. Reget remained a stronghold of Romano-Brittonic culture, thus until its downfall in 730. Then you have Gododin. We have archaeological finds locally indicating that local Roman and Christian elite controlled this area, including present-day northeast England and southeast Scotland, until the mid-7th century. The Votadini tribe and their successors, the Manab Gododin, established a kingdom that is celebrated in the late 6th century poem I Gododin. This source serves as a tribute to the heroes gathered by the Lord of Din Edin, we'll see it later, talking about modern Edinburgh, by the way, to fight against the Anglo-Saxon invaders of Deira and Catterick, that is, today's Catterick in Yorkshire. Although the region had only occasionally been part of the Roman Empire, the poem reflects a sense of camaraderie among the warriors and other Romano-Brittonic communities. However, the same kingdom ultimately fell to the Anglo-Saxons of Bernicia around 640. Finally, we have Strathclyde, southwest and western central Scotland. This was likely the home of the Damnoni people, mentioned in a solitary 2nd century AD source. A mid-5th century realm is referenced in a letter from St. Patrick that speaks of a king named Caratic, also known as Coroticus or Gulatic. By the end of the 6th century, such dynasty had likely consolidated locally extended from the Firth of Clyde into Cumbria, with rulers known as reges of Allochwater, Altclut, and a significant fortress at Dunbreton. The Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons annexed Strathclyde in the early 7th century, but it regained independence after the Battle of Nectanesmere in 685. Around the mid-8th century, Strathclyde faced a threat from an alliance of Northumbrians and Picts, leading to the Northumbrians seizing much of its western territory and forcing the Romano-Britons into submission. We are in 756. Of all these powers, as we were saying before, only the Welsh kingdoms managed to survive. The Romano-Brittonic realms in Wales saw, in fact, the emergence of royal dynasties by the late 5th century, with Duro-Trajan hill forts likely serving as royal centers in regions lacking otherwise urban evidence south of the Wensdyke. These places were among the least Romanized in Britain in general, so it's almost paradoxical. Of course, they would continue mostly that Roman legacy. In contrast, the urban elite residences persisted in some centers north of the Wensdyke. We're talking, of course, about modest settlements, but still maintaining an administration with some bureaucratic features until the 7th century, both areas retaining aspects of late antique Christian identity, including the widespread use of Latin, for example, among the Romano-Brittonic elites, which is really striking. In the narrative, of course, of the much later source of Geoffrey of Monmouth, the general Brockmail is referred to as consul of the city during the Battle of Chester in 616. However, Cadwallon of Gwynedd is soon after noted simply as a lord or leader in the 30s of the 7th century. In the aforementioned Igododin, this poetic source, highlighting heroic acts in battle and loyalty rooted in communal celebrations, of course we see that general clanic, almost tribal element that had blended together with this post-Roman reality. A figure named Tuflich is distinctly rector and helmsman, literally, with leaders described as regulators of hosts, which, as we'll see now, may have had to do with the continuation of some sort of unknown military supply system survival. We have archaeological evidence from hill forts such as Dinas Bovis and Dinas Emrys, showing how the local royal households were accumulating significant wealth that truly contributed at large to maintain a fit military force. There are some studies showing how this post-Roman Welsh world was, of course, ruled by warlords themselves, like relying on clients working for them as peasants, and so being maintained as a military elite by the local agricultural labor. Welsh townships consisted of free or bond tenants who provided food rents and military service. The small scale of the later Romano-Brittonic forts reflects a personal and individual military obligation rather than sort of more widely organized territorial system. Indeed, the late antique one had been deteriorating and sort of evaporating to an extent, leaving space to this private clienteles for local rule and and defense. The structure of the church is important militarily speaking, albeit not very well known for early medieval Wales, at least not as much as this broader lay reality. However, there are hints suggesting that senior church officials operated similarly to secular leaders. Of course, their lifestyle was quite militarized, right? Even leading forces into battle. There's really nothing strange. We have talked about sort of the more famous and better documented sort of high late medieval warrior bishops, but these words were pretty similar in essence. Bards later celebrated Saint Tisilio, for example, a warrior saint and son of Brockmail, for his participation in battle. This idea of the warrior saint is very much spot on for the transition of from some so-called pagan practice into the later, say, canonization of individual Christian saints, because many of these had been heroes in a way, and that in the sort of more strictly warrioristic sense of those tribal cultures, and later their image was sort of transformed mostly in a spiritually ideal sense. But of course, they were actual fighters and warriors, and the way they would have been seen at the time was not already different from that idea of sanctity, exactly because of their military deeds. In the life of St. Cadog, a late 11th century account, indeed late, but still relevant, the saint is depicted as a dominant lord with a retinue of horsemen, illustrating the intertwining of military power and religious leadership in this area. There had been, of course, a lot of, at that point, influence from the same continent. Also, the Carolingians had their own secular saints, warriors and knights and saints. Think about Gerald of Aurillac. Ragged fell as a polity after the Battle of Dagestan in 603. This was fought between the King Ethelfrid of Bernicia and Aidan mac Gabrain, the king of the Riada, that were essentially like the most aggressive Scots that had created this kingdom just across like the strait between Scotland and Ireland, and were sort of hegemonizing the clash. Despite having a smaller force, the Anglo-Saxon Ethelfrid achieved a decisive victory, although his brother Theobald fell in combat. The exact location of Dagestan or Dagestan remains unknown, though one possibility is Dulstane in Liddesdale, Scotland. What is interesting is that for all these sort of legendary battles were fought in this very formative years of the English nation and the settlement of the Celtic ones, there is just this consonance with the place. It's practically impossible just to archaeologically spot with certainty the places. Sometimes, like with an accurate research, it's possible, but as you know by now, what we had to find more or less in order to identify these battlefields, unfortunately, is what we will remain with for eternity. Elmet succumbed to the same Dairens around 620. Gododin was crushed by the Bertnicians around 638. Dumnonia, as you understand, ultimately fell to Wessex between 815 and 838. Still have to make a video on the West Saxons, by the way. Strathclyde endured independency until 945, when it was absorbed by Scotland. Going back in time to the aforementioned duchas that affirmed themselves at the departure of the Roman mobile force of Britain. These were described, as we have already seen in part, in the contemporary sources as tyranni, meaning thus usurpers or despots in that specific literary history, commanded bands of retainers, essentially bodyguards, known as commanipulares, which is a very interesting term, at least in the way it's used from the sources that now we want to look at, say, philologically in detail, but this means essentially those who share the same maniple. It's a bit of a classicistic, of course, choice, dictionarily speaking. However, these formed the backbone of their armies because essentially they were the best troops that they had. They were a bit like the same concept of the later Huscarls, for example, or the same things to some degree. Many of the old hill forts were refortified exactly by these individuals, serving as permanent bases or just different point d'appui, being garrisoned likely by such commanipulares themselves. That's literally, again, what happened. Later lords and their huscarls, right, this and that fortification. Which means that through such naturally more primitive system, some form of central authority may have actually persisted. And much of this overlapped with what had been the late Roman one, how it had been transforming, as we've seen, for example, along Hadrian's Wall in the far north as a frontier area. Arthur, as you know, bore the title of Dux Bellorum, or in Celtic, Tivisavsk Lu, meaning leader of battles or leader of the army, suggesting a level of primacy, some sort of higher ranking over the other duces, for how they had come to be now in a more seigneurial sense. Gildas recounts the emergence of such, let's say, lesser degree duces over time, right, from the decay of Roman administration into the darkest of the ages as far as documentation is concerned. Recounts the emergence of the sort of first, most famous of them, that is Ambrosius Aurelianus. In the context of the broader resistance to the Germanic invaders in particular, but not all. Ambrosius Aurelianus, as you understand also from the name, would have been a descendant of an aristocratic Roman family. He said to be the son, in fact, of a Roman officer and a Brythonic mother who were killed by the Saxons, rallied his followers, referred to as cives, so literally citizens in this probably political, civic identity of that had already dramatically deteriorated from centuries, but still evoked the order of liberty in Romanity, to confront the Anglo-Saxon invasion. This clash had mixed results, with Ambrosius potentially also facing off against Vortigern, Celtic ruler that may have died in a civil war amidst ongoing strife among both Brittonic political factions in the early 6th century. Nennius later gives Ambrosius the title of Magnus Rex inter reges Britanniae, so to say the greater sort of high king, right, of the Brittonic rulers, suggesting also an effort to unify the Britons and the remnants of Roman troops in Britain to face the foreign invasion. Ambrosius likely managed to consolidate his power in the west, from which he carried out also to a degree an effective resistance, ruling over areas from the channel to Hadrian's Wall, and is known in Welsh as Ermis Wledig. Now, speaking of Arthur, that we already mentioned, the debate, of course, about the existence, the identity, and the status of this figure is still, legendary as much as the same. However, there is the documentation is very scarce, and probably no other figure historical was so, overly, let's say, mythologized in a pseudo-historical sense like him. But indeed, we know of this Arthurius, which of course is a name of Celtic origin, by the way, referred to the warrior beasts practices of divine transfiguration, specifically the bear, right? So sort of berserker. So hence Arthur fighting against the Anglo-Saxons in the early 6th century. Allegedly supported by all the rulers and manpower of Britain, he scored at least 12 victories. He's thought to have been a Romano-Brittonic warlord, holding the aforementioned title of Dux Bellorum, and having hence all the knightly, say, legion, the one of the Paladini, so this sense of also cataphract, technically speaking, Romanity, leading armored cavalry, in fact, against the Saxons. I made a video about the presence of the Alans, of the Sarmatian auxiliaries in Gaul. Britain had them, so it's believed notoriously that the entire story of the sword in the stone derives from this Iranian burial mounds, weapon stuck on top of it. I made a video about the sword, the magic powers of the sword in the Irano-Germanic culture. There is a lot about this, and it's definitely possible that the Romano-Britons had some sort of cataphract cavalry at this point, also in probably some of the heaviest sense that we can imagine. We'll talk more about this, so do not despair if I just touch on this en passant, because we have to understand what's just recently one of you asked me about Celtic equestrian culture, connections between Brittany, for example, and the Alans as well. We'll definitely get there at some point. In any case, Gildas highlights for Arthur the greatest success of the Battle of Baton Hill, marking a pivotal moment in this Romano-Brittonic counteroffensive that essentially Arthur picked after having been left by Ambrosius. This battle is described by Gildas as really the great topic, glorious victory, followed by in fact a prolonged pause in the Anglo-Saxon advancement, which is possible and even likely, right? And linked, of course, to also the general difficulties in this heavily destabilized situation that the Germans were meeting with, sort of also exploiting the meager resources that at this point we're talking about incredibly poor material culture. We are witnessing an important contraction of the resources, and things would get sort of worse even as you know in the second half of the same century. But this Romano-Brittonic resistance would have been really hard for the times and places. And despite the skepticism regarding the Arthurian legend that actually stems from just a later 9th and 10th century historiography, the idea that the Brythonic control would have remained strong and firm throughout the 6th century seems to be correct. Gildas does not even talk about Arthur. He refers to other duces of the time. He likely himself lived during the era of Dutgirm, that can be identified as Kindairn and Kingar. Arthur appears in the Arleian genealogies together with another warrior, Urien ap Reged. And so this is an old Welsh genealogy dating to the 12th century. However, it's admittedly based on earlier oral traditions and may tell us something about the ethos, if anything, of this Romano-Brittonic resistance. To be frank, Arthur seems to have been some sort of, if not completely made up character. However, say the sum of multiple ones, or maybe of one specific individual that, however, we do not know practically anything in a strictly historical sense, may have not specifically defeated the Anglo-Saxons in a single battle. It may have been a broader effort of the Romano-Brittonic war there to put a halt to the Anglo-Saxon advance. But of course, these peoples were very interested in that moment in history. The Germans in the continent, were really crafting traditions like the one of the Nibelungenlied. You can imagine for the Romano-Britons here defending their own heavenly citadel in a way from this hordes, coming from darkness, as being sort of some of the most exciting moments in their entire history. So something definitely remains in this legion that is true, that is historical. The bard Taliesin, that would have been a contemporary of Arthur and Urien, according to the 13th century tradition, would have written poetry about both heroes, thus affirming further their significance in the legion. The Annales Cambriae, that were transcribed likely around the mid-10th century, tell us something more about Arthur, which shows that basically this oral tradition was founded on some kind of historical figure or some kind of legion, at least, that had matured around that day and age regarding this conflict. And according to these accounts, after a series of military victories, as we know, Arthur ultimately dies in an internal strife, by the way, that's also realistic, against his nephew Mordred, and died in the Battle of Camlan around 537 or 543. It's literally almost all that we know about this, so I surely will make a video about Arthur at a point, but sort of it's all more disappointing as far as the historical specifics than, and especially in this case, probably the most disappointing figure in history, considering the hype around it, but the scarcity on which this was built. What is really instead immortal in fascination regarding Arthur is, of course, the entire context and the fact that, in a broader, say, traditional sense, there was a real strife of this kind of the Romano-Britons against the Anglo-Saxons that sort of out there, still in the national legacy, the identity of the British Isles to an extent. Now, a few figures are recorded during this broader period of post-Roman Brythonic armies concerning such forces themselves. Speaking of the size of armies at this point, we do not know too much, as you can understand, but say from a source or another, you always find, and you know better because I listed literally thousands of them in a chapter of my doctoral thesis, with tens of thousands of citations. Naturally, I can't do this for the early 14th century and some sort of most developed places in Western Europe. Here it's different, but we still can't get a dimension, a scale. All right, we have, for example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle citing 4,000 casualties at the Battle of Crickford in 456, quite early in time. And of course, like regarding the reliability now, the numbers, where did they get these numbers from historically or whatever? This is a completely different story. That's all we have, so we have to be humble and thankful at the same time for what we have. Now, 4,000 casualties entail something like possibly at least double the number of the army. This would be too high. Actually, make the forces smaller. It would entail 12,000 from a side, let's say, and therefore something similar in scale. The other at this point in history, yeah, why not? Mid 5th century Britain. The same source talks about 5,000 casualties in an unnamed battle in 508 and 2,000 at the Battle of Bendon in 614. We know that in 616 at Chester, Salif of Powys likely brought a significant military force to the battle, summoning the reguli of his realm, each contributing their own household troops, we will see in a while. Bede expressed horror in the 30s of the 7th century. Consider that he is a source. The end of the 7th, the beginning of the 8th century. The army that fought at Catterick in 598 may have numbered as few as 300 men, although this figure may only represent the chieftains. The source is the E. Godwin, so describing an actually extraordinary British effort to challenge the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdom of the era. Mastering this 300 warriors, primarily from the southeast of Scotland. And so we have this number, 363 specifically, and the description of these individuals is quite meaningful. The source highlights the elite commanding figures adorned in gold, led by 3 leaders wearing golden torques. So this triptychal recurrence here with 363, etc., may actually indicate this maniples. Like it actually, like as you know, the maniples historical, like at least in the Polybian legion, were exactly 120 men, right? So maybe there might have been something similar at this point, like basically the equivalent of a company, and aforementioned sources calling commanipulares these guys that are exactly like the retinue of these incredibly wealthy warriors. The golden torques also bring us back to those, again, warrior beast practices, and a mark of fidelity and some sort of mix here, mostly Celtic, say military spirituality, warlike spirituality. Each of these armored leaders in the source may have had foot soldiers among them, potentially bringing in the total force here not to 300 but to multiple thousands of men. We will talk about the foot in a while, because we have to first concentrate on the mounted forces at this point are really something. The text obviously is somewhat ambiguous. We've seen that Gaelic sources talk about similar numerical correspondences in what would appears definitely to be a symbolical, magical reference. So we have this. We can think of both 100 men units and 300 men commands of some sort, and there is the possibility that this combined cavalry infantry force would have also been able to cross a space that counts exactly 130 miles from Deer Street to the Tees valleys. We know that at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, that was fought likely around the beginning, maybe 503, we'll see now better the chronology, there were enough Brittonic troops to kill 960 Anglo-Saxons in a single assault. This is just like to give a figure of the scale of casualties in this engagement. So we're talking about, of course, particularly small battles. They are, in a general sense, compared, like if you consider from which, from the extent of the communities that they had brought them to the field. It is not like in other parts of Western Europe, more compact regional kingdoms, etc. But it's still remarkable because it does speak about an intense level of militarization, which doesn't even, again, produce any particular development in the art of war characterizable in other terms, but still in terms of individual skills, like individual fighters, like would have been a hell of a school. In fact, if you look at that video made on the pigs, on the Fiannas, etc., you realize more or less in what kind of mental order these people were. But of course, we must at least refer briefly to the Battle of Badens. Fundamentals. This was a clash between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. We do not know exactly when, like in the late 5th or early 6th century, and it was the significant Brittonic victory halting the Anglo-Saxon expansion for a while. The earliest references of a battle come from Gildas, that we know, in the 6th century. It was a Brittonic cleric, describing it more as a siege than an actual pitched encounter, which also makes sense to a degree because like also the strategic nature of these engagements, like sometimes were too small, like they would concentrate around, as it was normal during the Middle Ages and actually also other ages, around fortifications. King Arthur is later noted as the participant in the battle in the 9th century Historia Brittonum by Nennius, which also confirms the Brittonic victory. So that's where Arthur gets sort of the this place in history for this greater Brittonic victories among other engagements that he is told to have succeeded in. Bede the Venerable, he was writing at the beginning of the 8th century, places the battle around 493-500, mentioning its occurring at 44 years after the Anglo-Saxons first settled in Britain. The Annales Cambriae and Geoffrey of Monmouth writings elaborate further on the Arthurian role, the details, etc. And while most scholars accept that the battle occurred, there is a significant debate regarding, as always, its exact date and location as well, with various sites suggested, including Bath and Lidington Castle. There is, of course, room for the contestation of the battle's historicity, with some speculating on the identity of the Saxon commander as well, possibly Ella of Sussex or Keldric. Organically, the largest Romano-Brittonic unit referenced in contemporary sources is the famous Teulu, which means family, serving essentially as the chosen bodyguard of a chief. This is the typical, again, backbone of a bit like the Comanipularis. They are overlapping. Just the name changes to a degree. Of course, there would have been different levels, as we will see now, of different scales of organization. But, say, in post-Roman Britain, leaders emerging as commanders of local war bands, known as the comitatus in Latin, we studied this also for the Germans at this point, or teulu in Welsh, were definitely relying on a bulk of force that was essentially detaching from the rest of the populace, as we've seen before in the broader Welsh politics and society, like as a military elite sustained by the rest of the population. With enormous expense, a sort of feudal system. And hence all the knightly, seigneurial, feudal ethos that would emerge together with Arthurian Brittonic literature later on in the late Middle Ages. These groups, like the Theulu that were associated with Deira, were essential to leadership. For example, Gwion ap Sindwin's brothers commanded a sizable troop, indicating the importance of military leadership in kingship. That's basically all they did during their entire lives. And of course, the largest the retinue, the more successful the ruler. As we've seen, the same Arthur is killed in a civil strife. It was completely normal to have this in internal clashes due to the general instability and also the scarcity of resources. The fact that these units themselves came from, as we've seen, a non-systemically, like not a non-statal background like in Roman times, but something also very, say, entrenched, anchored to very specific places. And spiders will see now their strategic projection capacities, the fact that they normally essentially rose each other's children at their homes to train them as squires and then as knights together with their own. This incredibly courtly, right, proto-courtly reality of constant military training for the elite and participating as much as possible, as we've seen with all these war bands, in the great battles of the time. Sometimes, again, very modest encounters, as we've seen, rarely exceeding, if ever reaching, like tens of thousands per side, but still, in fact, the greatest dream of all these warriors since childhood. We know that a king like Minidog Midfather could gather an army without fighting himself, but these are the exceptions of politics. Members of a war band often resisted sharing glory and loot with anyone but their king. If anything, it was him who would seize this and eventually distribute it. And for this reason, they were wary of foreign hostages or mercenaries because they thought that they could steal their job, which was actually quite frequent, right? And there were lots of different warriors out there. We've seen, the Gaelic Fiannas. There is a great expansion from Ireland at this point in St. Pictland. And here, especially the Welsh, the Dominions, the Britons have to still defend their interland from such ravages and acts of piracy, but in many ways they behaved in the same way that they were just barely more civilized. The term Gosgord usually translates as a retinue. It might refer to a larger force than the Theulu. However, there are some problems in interpreting this definition. In the E. Gododin, Minidog's Gosgord seems to imply a leadership group within a broader army, to a sort of high command. Different terms are used for different type of hosts, with little distinction, for example, between the three faithful war bands and the three noble retinues, each comprising allegedly 2,100 men participating in the Battle of Arderit. There is also another word that is Nefer, often associated with the Theulu itself, suggesting the numbers of fighters, but also possibly referring to an entire courtly household, at least in the later texts that document when courts had sort of developed a bit more in this sense. Military followers of a lord were also described, obviously also, and later especially in Latin. There are milites, satellites, tirones, so they all have a different exception, and the miles is just like soldier, essentially And the satellite, of course, stresses the clientary connection. Then the Tyrannus are directorates, basically, and they sort of intertwine. So these terms were not really even meant to be categorical, but they all have sort of a different shade of meaning. Searching for different numbers of the talus consistence, we realized that they changed wildly. Say the average would have been something like 300 men, so essentially 3 companies, something you could play with in a compact way using reserves, gradual effort, and still knowing most of those who counted. The Taulu was an elite force, right? It was meant to be this contained to a degree. As we will see now, the equestrian element is particularly relevant. There is a poem from the mid-7th century mentioning the aforementioned Kindelan maintaining as many as 700 warriors at his court, right? These were proper lords, so understood as children of noblemen, and this essentially exemplified the munificence of this ruler that was leading them into the Battle of V-VIII, in fact in 654. We also have lots of names of these individuals that evidently were important ones, and also suggesting just by itself the existence of a professional military elite supported by aristocratic war bands. As we'll see now, the rest of the troops were pretty much levies, peasantry forming a part-time, semi-regular force like a militia, and of course organized under various banners in the battle, but still dependent on these higher lords that had brought them there, and that they had surely an auxiliary role in combat. We will look in another video at the Romano-Brittonic tactics at this time, but if you're a bit interested in how the system worked very similarly, I already made a couple of videos on Pictish warfare from a tactical point of view that can be interesting. Resources were limited, so that's why we get this relatively small numbers. But even considering this 700 noblemen, more likely because we have the names of the best ones, so the others might have been just some sort of a retinue of the same, still of some status, but not as powerful as them. We can think of still essentially a heavy force by, say, literal weight standard of arms and armor. That was really like the shock element, the spearhead. As early as the 30s of the 5th century, one northern Brythonic chieftain reportedly commanded as many as 900 cavalry. It's been hypothesized that this would be a Taulu composed of 3 units of 300, but there is not necessarily an evidence. The fact is, yes, that sometimes these forces were counted just in horsemen, because as we've seen, the infantry was sort of a lesser element in this proto-chivalric reality. We're talking, actually at this point in history still, infantry being the so-called queen of battles, but the Celts had something for horsemen, and use of large cavalry forces, which in this number, however, doesn't mean necessarily that they were all sort of heavy or elite, right? Actually, it's more likely that they were segmented with just an elite within this 900, and the others being also lighter troops, skirmishers, raiders, we'll see now. The Taulu frequently included, as we've seen, men from other kingdoms. It was a normal practice. War bands coming from everywhere, participating to the big clash. The more they were, the more they could punch into enemy territory unopposed and looting, hopefully sharing sort of an adequate amount of loot. And although the majority were relatives of the chief, of course there were so many foreigners coming from very far away places. In the video about Gaelic warfare, we noticed how there were surely at this time around like Gaelic Norse pirates Roman, the famous Attacotti that nobody really knows where they came from. And so a much greater mobility than merely like the Romano-Brittonic reality. In the 10th century, the laws of Hywel from Wales required the commander of the bodyguard to be a son or nephew of the king. The 10th century, and I made some videos about this strengthening properly of a nobility or military class exactly at this point. Of course, it's very distant from the clinic, basically tribal reality of the 5th century, if we go as back as that. Probably also for Britain, the second half of the 6th century is the major turning point for the dominance of cavalry over infantry, but which is not the decisivity of the same, but it's possible again that the Celts, and especially during these raids, because that's the sort of strategic operational reason why cavalry forces were so important, may have had a higher amount of mounted troops than even maybe the same Romans that were heavier, and that's the reason why they could actually fence off that cavalry. The same goes for the Anglo-Saxons, for that matter, and never underestimate the fact that, of course, like both the Romans and the Germans had actually important forces, as it's witnessed in this case also from the fact that these Romano-Brythonic forces are not merely Celtic forces; they are also Roman to some extent in legacy. The Teulu, considered this, of course, is a pretty generic term continuing to exist into the 12th century. And society wasn't even changing that enormously much, especially in the Celtic fringe. But at this point, we know that the nobiliar regulation injuncted this force to consist only of the 14 to 20 years old sons of freemen, which was definitely an elite fostering, the military fostering unit of the rulers of the land. Now, soldiers from various origins, referred to as milites by Nennius, fought for loot or rewards from their duces. This was the political hierarchical playout. The term exercitus, so the army, conventionally intended in a broader levy sense of all the sort of the available manpower, at least a section of one of an entire, for example, provincial reality, was specifically used for the Romano-Brittonic forces mobilized against the Anglo-Saxon invasions. This is very important because it shows you how, of course, the Anglo-Saxons in general were the strongest, had the upper hand, had confined the Romano-Britons into the fringe of the island. And in order to repel the Germans, the Romano-Britons needed all the manpower available in their land, which would have just been mobilized because otherwise, they could have not defended their farms and from the Germanic ravages. The only military formation noted at this point was the generic battle line, which of course makes a lot of sense. So it would have been different combinations for sure, but we don't have to think there to have even been the need for anything more tactically complicated. It's possible that the duches in the militarized north and possibly southeast Wales employed the remnants of the Roman military. We're talking about actual units that had somehow survived intact, right? Probably not very large, but still, right? Especially the ones deployed at a local level. But especially also the mobile ones maybe being integrated into the personal retinue, the tail of the dukes. It's possible that instead, in fact, the latter institution was stronger simply north and west Wales, so that their already local military families were stronger, and even though there were some Romano-Britons that from the southeast of the island that moved in there, that there was some sort of prevalence eventually of some more locally clanically developed military systems other than the Roman one that required also specific administration. So if you want an equivalent of the Teulu from the Anglo-Saxon side, it would be the Saxon Hearth-troop, the Hearth-troop, right? And when you look at the type of warfare involved here, of course there was a prevalence of siege warfare, right? There were lots of different and smaller and sort of lost to a degree, also archaeologically, castles that would be constantly attacked. The only sort of safe haven for many involved, just even for protecting the local population, saving them and their cattle during the enemy raids. This was really what the Romano-Britons would have, especially the Celts, would have kept doing one another as well, hadn't even the Germans arrived. There were, however, also open field engagements, hence the aforementioned reference to battle lines. There's for, say, major strategic forces in this context to get it over with in the main clash. Particularly, and this would continue in British military history, at the conjunction of major highways and river crossings, where defenders aimed to intercept swift raiders, but also where logistically the major forces had to go along, because of course they would have just found more supplies, communications would have been easier, etc. And some rightfully believe that echoes of Roman battle formations and tactics persisted. Right? It's not like, especially, I don't know, the Roman or the Germanic forces were fighting in particularly different ways. The same is valid for the Celts, even though these had sort of a lighter bias. But you would have been amazed at how similar they all looked, as a matter of fact, if anything, from a material point of view. Gilda's criticism of the Britons for lacking organized military tactics indicates that such strategies were still recognized and expected from capable commanders in his time. Remember that Gildas was looking at the past and saying, these duces are tyrants. They had everything degenerating before there was an effective military. Now it's just war bands and so on. So, of course, he was being harsh in judgment for obvious political and moral reasons. However, there was surely, from one side, the preservation, previous military standards, the attempt of doing so, and on the other, the gradual degeneration to something else. In fact, besides sieges and pitched battles, the other more frequent type of engagement was a raiding party. All right, and in this, especially the Celts brought a lot of experience in, because they had been historically on the fringe. For this reason, they had to be good at things like ambushes. If they triggered the Roman reaction, as you know, the Caledonians were annihilated to the point they had to change name into the Picts after the early 3rd century Roman raising of the country. And on the other side, whenever there was an instability in this richer British southeast, launching raids deep into it, for which they had to be very well organized. There is all sort of an internal frontier dimension, especially at this point. Some of this kind of warfare survives in some, in fact, other border zones in British military history during the Middle Ages and beyond. But if we were to describe an Arthurian task force, we would probably look at a very interesting group headed by armored riders akin to late Roman cavalry. in part for the most rapid activities deep into enemy territory, lacking infantry support, because people think that cavalry travels faster than infantry, strategically speaking, like on the succession of marches. This is not really true. If you consider that still this cavalry has to be sustained, there are wagons, they actually at some point are surpassed even by infantry, somehow more efficient. At least the horses cost really a lot. They must take care of them, they must get that amount of fresh water, particular forage, and so on. However, when the objective is looting, devastating, and so on, and just living off the land, you can organize this force, and not even just as the skirmisher, but actually some very skilled and even heavy troops that would have thus excelled in speed mobility for a while, crossing, as we'll see now, also hundreds of miles at a point, and particularly well suited for all these scattered Romano-Brittonic kingdoms that needed quick support in case of Anglo-Saxon invasion, and therefore, managing also to support this movement logistically for one another. Cavalry units could go as far as 50-60 kilometers a day. This is not strange. Like if you look at medieval armies, they went as fast as ancient ones. There is nothing properly in any categorical sense that shows otherwise. I studied this thing in great depth, actually. And consider, by the way, Britain still had at some point fairly well-maintained network of Roman roads. If you look at the 5th, even the 6th century, those highways did work well enough. That's what they had been created for, except at this point there was no wall, there were no, at least, major regional forces to stop the raiders that could in fact use such paths. At the aforementioned Battle of Catherine in 598, combined cavalry and infantry force could have traveled along the 100 and almost 200 kilometers from their street to the Tees Valley north of Catterick in about 10 days, right? British history as an importer of horses like Frisian breeds, especially at this point in its strong Celtic cavalry tradition, supports the idea at least of a mobile force capable of this large-scale operations. Actually, Britain did not have particularly good, let's say, a particularly good horse breeding environment as a whole. In fact, British cavalry would remain, up to the Normans, somewhat underdeveloped compared to the continental standards. We're talking resources, we're talking societal, let's say, organization. It's not like the fact there couldn't be the very good cavalry that, feudal England had for that matter, historically. But at this point, we're looking at mounted forces mostly designed for raiding at large. So actually, cavalry would have been sort of lighter than we think, except for these remnants, as we've seen, of like Arthur's paladins, or maybe we can imagine as sort of heavenly cataphracts, even with some Sarmatian blood in their veins and armor on their bodies. Really riding ferociously as a radical shock force, except a very costly and sort of small one numerically. The Teulu is thus a bit the reflection of this strategy and operational habit. The idea of collecting like a bulk of cavalry that works as a shock force, but also with enough lights to raid around, being able to sustain themselves out there in the open with some rations for just a given amount of time, and managing to to move along the path. Naturally, also depends on the operation. There would have been wagons, there would have been infantrymen as well, but preferably, at least for the sort of medium operations or operations that had to be that surgically precise, like being able at least to perform such cavalry-only raiding an enterprise and storming a fortress there, looting, loading stuff, their own horses, other pack animals, etc., but mostly moving fast across a territory that, as we've seen at this point, lacked really the idea of a barrier that could stop them. It was better just to, again, enclose themselves into a fort, waiting for these guys to raid, to destroy things if you didn't have any force to counter them, because they would concentrate such high specific weight. If there are just a bunch of skirmishers, you can have sometimes just even the local peasants taking care of that bloodily from both sides. So it really depends, but if you just picture it in a general sense, you realize how sort of messed up that this whole lifestyle really is, like from both sides, like considering the general instability and how violent this settlement really was. Of course, there was infantry. The spear armed, normally they would have had different types of weapons, including probably a lot from the late Roman Constantinian style arsenal, including darts of all sorts and like treasured arms and armor, very old centuries. This is typical of the French areas, by the way. These forces were known as pedit, which of course is definitely a Celtic borrowing from the Latin peditus. During the average Romano-Brittonic campaign, there were both rustic levied infantry as the aforementioned mounted elite forces. Since most operations revolve around sieges of some sort, you couldn't do really without infantry for blockading the settlement and just setting up like this circle defense, like gathering resources around, working even just as engineers and so on. Talia St. Point mentioned the pedit infantry cheering for Urien after a successful raid, which sort of makes sense. This infantry, again, today we don't talk tactics, but they would have supported this cavalry that, as you see here, I don't know the specifics actually, but they would have also just greeted some the horsemen that went out there for some temporary raid or were skirmishing in front of the lines or challenging themselves into single combat, admired by these footmen. Any other organic consideration is very difficult to extrapolate. One version of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle refers to the 4,000 casualties at the aforementioned Crackenford battle as 4 troops, basically suggesting the existence of a unit of 1,000 men. This seems, by the way, really plausible, considering that there would have been some sort of decimal system. 10 men as the smallest unit, but could have been some sort of a bernali, then a company size, etc. We know in fact of a smaller unit termed the Cant that was really this 100 men. This really doesn't change too much. It's, of course, there were different unit sizes, but there is also some broader human universal standard for troops, for derives from the way we count, the way we are shaped, etc. How many fingers we have, that more or less remains the same throughout military history. Now, next to the Romano-Brittonic forces, as we understood, there would have been a lot of foreigners, and primarily Anglo-Saxons. So what we mean is actually Saxons, Angles, Frisians, Jutes, Franks, Danes, and more, as a matter of fact. So people coming from Scandinavia, Merovingian forces of some adventurers of sort. Like, so actually the channel was quite trafficked at the time. We've seen Frisian horse imports. Consider that, again, next door you have like the Frankish world that is gradually fostering like the strongest cavalry in the West throughout these centuries. Without mentioning that in Roman times there had been federati units stationed in Britain of different kind, different specialties, mostly coming from that Celto-Germanic background, but also Iranians, as we've seen. When the Romano-Britons are left on their own, they start hiring such mercenaries themselves. We've seen it with the Anglo-Saxons, Vortigern. We know that the first contingent of Romano-Brittonic employed Saxons comprised 3 keels in 428 under Hengist. So a keel should be similar to the Needham ships of the era, which would number, in this case, a company size, 150 men, which, as we've seen, is likely what this is a bit bigger, but what the Teulu itself was made up, like 3 of this company-sized troops, which therefore sound quite adequate for the type of political and military concentration of Romano-Brittonic, the Romano-Brittonic board, also for the Anglo-Saxons to step into as a competitive force. The second contingent, which arrived around 437, consisted of 19 keels, which thus would amount to almost 3,000 men. So really coming in force, and that's a trend, as you know, that would reinforce itself. The Romano-Britons had a navy on its own. The Litus Saxonicum was provided with lots of those. You know that's essentially in the southeast is the most fortified area of Roman Britain, besides the walls in the north, obviously to resist the Saxon pirates, but also partly settling some of them. And so from there, not just there were like great forts to defend the shores from it, but of course like some portual facilities. There was all a naval capacity that we have highlighted also in the videos about Gaelic warfare, because the Romans would chase these pirates seemingly even as far as Iceland possible. So it's not that when the Roman mobile army left Britain, the Romano-Britons were incapable of taking the sea. Quite the contrary, and probably that's one of the single most underestimated parts of this all, even though, of course, the Anglo-Saxons broke through, and aside from, of course, all the amphibious warfare you would have found, like once they had broken through, at that point it's just about defending in a general sense, and it's better to invest in a land force than a ship, if anything. We'd just better build a fort to prevent other Germanic war bands to land there to meet them on the shore. Arthur in the legend is recorded to have possessed at least 2 large vessels. Nickname, of course, these are later names, also vaguely inspired to, the Viking period. Grim Smiler, which sank around 512, and Fairform. They may have actually had some sort of plausibility, at least as names. Again, they were probably inspired to other, memories, but it's not like, again, these Germanic invaders were very different, for example, from the ones of the Norse period, nor the same Romano-Britons would have been stranger to that kind of invaders from even previous centuries. We know of Giles, of course, with their cuirass being employed as late as the end of the 6th century by the Romano-Brittonic forces. We know even of a Visigothic naval force, plus embarked troops used in the early 6th century. You have a 9th century source indicating that Frankish mercenaries were there. The latter is a very late example. We are in Carolingian times, and of course there would have been a great expansion of, unfortunately, not particularly documented warriors that sort of alluded to what would have happened in a couple of centuries with the Crusades, with mercenaries going far and wide, etc. The Vikings, if anything, for a long time were taking their place. But it's also a period that we're not really looking at. Just know that in the 10th century, Welsh princes, of course, occasionally hired Vikings, other than just fighting them. It was completely normal. Speaking of the aforementioned capacity of local Romano-Brittonic government to sustain the army through the historical unknownness of fixed quantities of supplies levied from, at this point, the church and the nobility, we have to imagine the system gradually degrading, also in similar ways to the ones observed in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. The same Anglo-Saxons, surely to a degree, even though that was really a very deteriorated reality they came to rule on, statally-wise, they would have exploited what was standing there, because it's not like there is, I don't know, some sort of abstract hypothesis of the unknown that it either works or does not work. It's always the same local communities that gather this fixed quantities of supplies, ratios that are really owed to whom? That's actually the most interesting question, because initially there is a state, there is a local public central administration, then over time you can imagine in the Romano-Brittonic world itself, the church, the nobility collecting such essentially food, but also cattle, it was billeting, was in exchange for that, simply because that's how the same hospitalities worked, as you know. We know of a Romano-Brittonic officer, likely deputed to this, known as Cais, that is to say, a collector of such resources. We know already at this point that there were differences between the lay and the clerical communities, the latter being tendentially exempt from such contributions, but not too much. In any case, of course, such taxes were unpopular, as they always are. In any case, they were also life-saving if an effective military system with this resource could be put together, as it would. And so, as time passed, things would also gradually change and or deteriorate further. That's how you have properly a statal professional army of some sort, and then, or at least with some integrated by some local militia, and then essentially just an army based on households, right? We know, we've seen it for the Dalriata Scots, for example, in the video about Scottish warfare. The households or treffs in the Romano-Brittonic world were organized into cantrefs, each comprising 100 households, or the newer kimvits, meaning neighborhoods, which presumably included, from a few to some tens of households that we can count, considering that a cantref was something from 2 to 4 kimvits. So there is a decimal organization remaining standing, as we observed before, a rota system, but also a tendency over the later period just to functionalize the local communities of the commoners, essentially, to just provide with, say, resources for supplying the cavalrymen and providing manpower only during the most pressing circumstances, which would have not been rare, as a matter of fact, and which could have actually mirrored a pressure from the same rulers that needed to compete with one another, and essentially also, of course, the local communities participating to such localistic competition, hatred, sense of identity. As you understand here, there is, yes, a broader sense of who is Romano-Brittonic or Germanic, whatever, but as a matter of fact, what you're looking at in both words, it's an importantly fragmented situation where also most of that difference would have sort of changed to a degree. Britain was really very Germanized, right? We can't count something like 1-to-1 in the ratio in Southeast would become England, in fact. However, it's obvious that the early Germanic invaders came to rule over a Romano-Brittonic system that began to support them, also against this fringe that would in fact historically remain a fringe. Right? Initially, these were the ousted Romans almost, but later they would become sort of the least developed place, mostly as a Celtic fringe, and so while maintaining a lot of, this is the most fascinating thing of this Roman legacy, still being, say, lagging behind. The Anglo-Saxon world is the one that actually inherited most of the Romanity that was still pouring out from Rome, from the evangelization, from the general organization of a more developed place, which is the one, in fact, which the Romans had ruled Britain to begin with. So you have all this great change in also in identities, etc. This is particularly evident in Britain more than in any other post-Roman Western Roman reality, except for Africa, perhaps. Parts of Spain, it really depends, but I mean in general as the first. If you look at the Germanic migrations first, I think that we have touched on an important number of issues, organizationally speaking. This was a bit more in depth than the usual count of specific units, but it's important to, in fact, reason a bit more in the vaster sense, having an idea of how this thing practically worked, how much of this world was really shattered to the extent of having a witness in a shrinking, definitely, of the previous statual capacities. It's a story that you can profitably follow from a military point of view, as we've done. For today, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.